In 1996, a year before the re-release of the Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition, a multi-million-dollar Lucasfilm cross-media Star Wars project was released, acting as both a marketing dry run for The Phantom Menace and filling the narrative gap between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. That project was titled Shadows of the Empire, and it changed the course of Star Wars forever? Sorry, I mean, forever, definitively. It's not a question.
He looks like a walking corpse, Shizor thought. Like a mummified body dead 1,000 years. Amazing he's still alive, much less the most powerful man in the galaxy. He isn't even that old. It's more as if something is slowly eating him. The viewer on the other end of the HoloLink would see a close-up of the Emperor's head and shoulders, but would not see Shizor, though Shizor would be able to see him. It was a measure of the Emperor's trust that Shizor was allowed to be here while the conversation took place.
What is thy bidding, my master?
If Shizor could have hurled a power bolt through time and space to strike Vader dead, he would have done it without blinking. Wishful thinking. Vader was too powerful to attack directly.
There is a great disturbance in the Force.
I have felt it.
We have a new enemy. Luke Skywalker.
Skywalker? That had been Vader's name, a long time ago. Who was this person with the same name? Someone so powerful as to be worth a conversation between the Emperor and his most loathsome creation.
The Force is strong with him. The son of Skywalker must not become a Jedi.
Son of Skywalker? Vader's son. Amazing. Shizor felt the smile, though he did not allow it to show any more than he had allowed his anger play.
If he could be turned, he would become a powerful ally.
Ah, Vader wanted Skywalker alive. That was what had been in his tone. Vader had no intention of killing Skywalker, his own son. That was obvious to one as skilled in reading voices as was Shizor. The Dark Prince smiled. He would attend to the business at hand, but he would not forget the name of Luke Skywalker.
Shadows was pitched as a Star Wars movie without a movie. Initially suggested in the early 90s, and at one point considered as an interquel between A New Hope and Empire, it was John Knoll whom suggested that the time period be shifted to allow for more dramatic possibilities. You see, The Empire Strikes Back really threw a sack full of hydro spanners into the universe. Luke Skywalker finds out the worst person in the universe was his father, right after being given a lesson in how not to not lose a hand. Yoda's left shaking his head being all, the galaxy, what are we gonna do? And Princess Leia, adrift with a now mobile rebel army, ponders the fate of the man she loves as he's doomed to become a frozen ornament of an intergalactic space gangster and slug. Sure, we all know now that it ends up pretty well, and then not so well for others, it turns out. But in the 90s, that gap between Empire and Jedi, that was largely unexplored. I mean, questions still remained. The aim was to tell this story through 3 different mediums: a novel, a comic book series, and a video game, each telling what is essentially the same narrative with additional and exclusive world building from each. This project was to be bolstered by action figures, plus trading cards and the like, because why wouldn't it be? By 1990, Star Wars had amassed tens of billions in profits from merch alone. Vice President of Licensing Howard Rothman and Lucy Wilson, Director of Publishing, mapped out the basic outline and assembled a story group not dissimilar from what's used today to map out the modern films and comics and video games and such. It was to expand on elements only hinted at in the films. The origin of Leia's bounty hunter disguise, Luke's new lightsaber, what the hell a Bothan was.
Many Bothans died to bring us this information.
As well as plans to introduce new characters and locations. The story promised fans that it would explore the deep underworld of gunrunners, spice traders, assassins and crime bosses that are only seen in the periphery of the films. One of these new underworld figures to be introduced was the third most powerful being in the galaxy, only to Vader and the Emperor himself. Shizor headed up the Black Sun organization, which had all the appearances of a legitimate business on the surface, dealing with things like trade and shipping, but underneath you've got this vast spy network, plus piracy, smuggling, assassination, dog kicking, driving through a puddle and intentionally soaking someone at a bus stop, and so forth. Shizor's narrative aim was to supersede Vader as the Emperor's right-hand man. Sorry, right-hand lizard man, with plans to eventually rule the galaxy solo. His master plan is ultimately to make Vader look foolish in the eyes of the Emperor by assassinating Luke Skywalker in a manner that disguises his own involvement. His motivations, though, are not strictly power-related. His hatred for Vader runs deep, as an Imperial bioweapon disaster on his homeworld of Forleen resulted in Vader carpet-bombing a large chunk of the planet, killing Shizor's family whilst he was off-world. As a result, Shizor had this information wiped from all known records, as he opted for a more cold and calculated long-term strategy to take down Darth Vader, as he could never best him in open combat. Shizor's wealth and power is such that there's a moment in the book where a rare jewel is gifted to him worth several million credits, which he then casually tosses across his desk, whilst thinking to himself, if it falls to the floor, I'm not going to bother retrieving it, and it would just be swept up by the cleaning droid. Also, in a meeting with Crime Lord Jabba the Hutt, he demands that he speak Basic, which is the Star Wars version of English, which Jabba does, because apparently he's capable of doing so, but just chooses not to. The look of Shizor took half a year to nail down, with early designs inspired by concept art from Return of the Jedi's Wormhead Creep Teeth, before finally settling on the design which remains more or less consistent across multiple platforms. Also, he emits a pheromone that makes him irresistible to all humanoid women, which gets quite a lot of play in the book, but we'll get back to that. With him comes Guri, a human replica droid, the only of her kind in existence. Considered priceless in value and deadly in punching, he uses her to enact any kind of dirty work, as no one suspects that this regular-looking human woman can do a triple somersault and then yank your heart from your chest. And lastly, we get the introduction of Dash Rendar. Smuggler, rogue, great pilot, bit of a bad boy. Basically a Han Solo type to fill in from the previous Han Solo type, Han Solo, and he's coupled with a wisecracking repair droid named Lebo. The backbone of this project was the Steve Perry penned novelization. He got this gig as a result of his work on the novelization of The Mask, a project that he took on at the very last minute for very little money. Editor Tom Dupree returned the favour by putting his name into the ring for Shadows. Though the major decisions for this story were decided upon as a group, Perry still had a hand in major elements from the book. Not all of his ideas, however, made the final cut, due to the stringent rules that ensured that the end result lined up with what Lucasfilm had considered appropriate for the universe. Perry, for example, wanted Luke to be able to understand R2-D2, but that was nixed, as that's not really what's shown in the films. Along with the idea that the Falcon would stop at an intergalactic gas station so a phone call could be made. Drew Struzan, the name associated with timeless movie posters spanning decades, whose work with Star Wars began with the 1978 re-release of the first film, was hired to create the book's cover. Originally, Luke was to sport his Return of the Jedi outfit, as opposed to his transitional beige, puffy vest. C-3PO and a TIE fighter were in place of Boba Fett and a swoop bike rider, and the first incarnation of Shizor had him in chainmail before this final design was settled upon. Probably a good move. Originally though, Shizor wasn't all bad, and was shown to be more nuanced in his motivations. Basically, instead of being a wholly terrible, drug-smuggling, slave-trading, alien psychopath, he would have some characteristics that the reader would empathise with. But still, all the other bad things that I said. Also, a big point of contention between the author and Lucasfilm was a relationship between Leia and Shizor. The plan outlined originally was to have Leia rendezvous with the Black Sun to make use of their vast spy network in the hope of determining who's the person behind the numerous attempts on Luke Skywalker's life, failing to realise until the last minute that it was in fact the head of Black Sun himself. All that made the cut, but originally when they meet, she was to have a natural and instant attraction to Shizor. This attraction was later changed to the influence of his alien chemistry. The story group though wanted to take the seduction further, and they ended up sleeping together, but Steve Perry insisted that it shouldn't go past the kiss that they share, which is then interrupted by Chewbacca. The counterpoint to Shizor, aside from Darth Vader, is that of Luke Skywalker, the man he has his sights set on killing. You see, whilst Shizor has everything, the best food, the best clothing, the most opulent palace on all of Coruscant, and even a machine that stimulates his muscles so he can work out by not moving at all, he values none of it. Luke Skywalker, on the other hand, spends months forging an artificial lightsaber duel in Obi-Wan's hut so he can cobble together a new weapon from secondhand scraps. But the thing is, you see that he values this new weapon, plus the friends that he has that he can lean on. The book does an excellent job of bringing Luke Skywalker from here to here, as he grows in confidence and his abilities in the Force continue to build before his inevitable showdown with Vader and the Emperor. There's a few things though that author Steve Perry pushed for that did make the final cut. 1. The droids get to fly the Millennium Falcon, and 2. Darth Vader was to be used as a point of view character. Now, I really believe that it's some of the best Darth Vader seen in any media, and despite getting quite a lot of pages dedicated to him, with the narrative revealing some very personal information, along with the vengeful and strategic nature of his mind, it adds to the character rather than feeling like an unnecessary explanation of his faults and desires. As mentioned, a large focus of this story is also on Princess Leia's attempt to retrieve Han Solo from Boba Fett, and the whole time her wondering if he even feels the same way about her as she does him. So what we end up with is 4 point of view characters in Princess Leia, Shizor, Luke Skywalker, and Darth Vader. Dash Rendar also plays a major role, but his adventures were more fleshed out in a video game that we'll be getting back to. Also, despite being a fairly major plot point, Boba Fett does not appear at all in the book, other than some of the main characters witnessing his ship escape at a distance as he conducts a mad race across the galaxy to collect the bounty on Han Solo, which was a large focus of the Dark Horse comic run. The Shadows of the Empire 6-issue miniseries was written by John Wagner, known for co-creating Judge Dredd in the late 70s, and published by Dark Horse, who have since gone on to lose the Star Wars license. Wagner was chosen for his ability to craft action and build suspense, whilst being able to work within the confines of an established universe, demonstrated in his work on Judgment on Gotham. Newcomer artist Killian Plunkett was chosen for the illustrations. This writer duo team was chosen by Dark Horse editor Ryder Windham, who was particularly impressed with Plunkett after seeing his submission for an Alien series in 1992, baffled as to why no one as of yet had hired him. Plunkett noted that one of the difficulties he came up against was drawing Darth Vader, as you got to deal with reflection and clunky shapes. As for the world building, well, he had reference materials like what had been done on Shizor, plus we got Doug Chiang designing spaceships, whom you might know as one of the concept artists on The Phantom Menace, among his many other roles at Lucasfilm over the years, including work on both The Force Awakens and Rogue One. Coruscant plays a pivotal role in the series, a location that yes had been explored in the books, but it still had very few visual references. Its first on-screen appearance wouldn't be until a year later in the 1997 special edition re-release of Return of the Jedi. However, there did exist concept art of a proto-Coruscant, then named Had Abaddon, created by Ralph McQuarrie, whom of which is largely responsible for the look of the original films. In a very early draft, Return of the Jedi was to have its final confrontation happen in the lower levels of Had Abaddon, whilst 2 Death Stars orbited the planet. All of this was changed, however, and what we got was the movie that everyone has seen, and I don't really need to get into it, do I? You know what, let's do it. Okay, so the year was 1983, and Return of the Jedi was set to rocket into cinemas, initially titled Revenge of the... Hugh Fleming took on the challenge of capturing the feel of Drew Struzan's work for the 6 covers. He's been responsible for a number of iconic Star Wars images you may be familiar with, and yet somehow his art submission for Star Wars Celebration 2019 was rejected, which is outrageous. The comic adaptation of Shadows of the Empire doesn't deviate from the narrative of the book, but elements are fleshed out. Plus we get entirely new scenes, such as where Boba Fett has a run-in with IG-88. It's stories like this that were also expanded upon in the likes of Tales from Jabba's Palace and Tales of the Bounty Hunters. I feel it's really the Boba Fett elements that really set this comic apart, as he tears across the galaxy, struggling to hold on to his intergalactic drug smuggler frozen in a grey concrete block. And along the way we get him bumping heads with assorted, lesser-known bounty hunters, some having been introduced in Empire, and some new. Another element added was the character of Jix, an Imperial agent working directly with that of Darth Vader, sent by Vader to Tatooine where Luke is hiding to ensure that he's not killed. Jix's story focuses on him infiltrating Jabba the Hutt's swoop gang and sabotaging any attempts that are made on Luke's life. The rest of the comic, aside from this, is really just a retelling of the events from the book, and that's where I feel this comic falls down. The story really shines when focusing in on Boba Fett and becomes less of interest when it's doing anything else. Having read the novel and then immediately following it up with this, the comic does feel like a watered down interpretation. I think this really would have benefited from being a solely Boba Fett tale that's mostly separate from all things Darth Vader, Shizor, and the Rebel Alliance. In the same way I guess that the video game has a big focus on showing us things that weren't touched upon in the novel. A 5-issue sequel series, Shadows of the Empire Evolution, was penned by Steve Perry and was released in early 2000, hinting that Shizor did survive the events of the story 4 years earlier, spoiler alert, where he exploded. It follows Guri on her quest to alter her programming in order to uncover her human side, if one even exists, clearly rattled by getting a severe kicking from an unarmed Luke Skywalker. Some core Star Wars characters and others introduced in Shadows are referenced and or seen, including one presumed dead, Dash Rendar. Shadows of the Empire on the Nintendo 64 was an absolute pioneer in terms of Star Wars games. Aiming to take advantage of the power of this newly released system, it follows smuggler slash scoundrel slash pilot slash it's just Han Solo again dash render as he battles his way across multiple chapters and playstyles, weaving in and out of the adventures of legacy heroes and villains. What you're actually seeing here is the PC version, released a year later, running at its optimum potential, as by today's standards, pretty much every Nintendo 64 game looks like a stack of murky triangles tripping over each other in an effort to give the player a seizure. Star Wars games had dabbled in 3D environments before this, with the likes of TIE Fighter, but for the most part this was faked, like in Super Empire Strikes Back and the on-rails Rebel Assault. So this was hailed as the first real-time rendered interactive 3D environment. Because also I guess Dark Forces doesn't count because all the bad guys appear as pixelated cardboard cutouts? Is that the reasoning? That seems right. Perrin Kaplan, Nintendo's corporate communications manager, said at the time that previous games would be limited to the movements of left to right, with a single colour range. But because the Nintendo 64 was so fast and powerful, they could provide different lighting for scenes, plus more fluid movements. The Nintendo 64 though was not without its limitations. For one, you need 14 hands to work the abysmal controller. A controller, I might add, the developers weren't allowed to look at, so it was kept in a box that they would put their hands into. Also, this was a cart-based system, when the rest of the world was moving to CDs. A CD can hold something like an hour and 20 of recorded dialogue for a video game, whilst with cartridges, it's mere minutes. That's why the pre-rendered cutscenes only appear in the PC version. So again, there were rules for what you can and can't do in the Star Wars universe. That still applied to video games. John Knowles made mention that the main characters from the movies can never die. That remained true of all video games, like how you can't kill Darth Vader in Super Empire Strikes Back, or Boba Fett in Dark Forces. Game developer Mark Haig Hutchinson said unlike previous side-scrollers and first-person shooters, the players wouldn't be limited to just one style. Shadows does it all, and by all I mean, not all, but still, quite a lot. We got third person, first person, aerial combat, turret shooting, and swoop bike racing. Because the graphical capabilities were said to take care of themselves on such an advanced system, the team could then focus on things like AI. Things could now be accomplished such as never before, such as opponents could now react to the player and have some environmental awareness. In the opening level, the Battle of Hoth, this intelligence was actually faked with the AT-ATs, as they always know where the player is, but are only programmed to react when you move within a certain range. Haig Hutchinson was quoted as saying, "At the end of the day, people don't care too much about what goes on under the hood. It's really a question of, is it a fun game?" And in answer to that, yeah, sort of. Some of the time. We'll get into that, but first a bit on dash render. Initial designs of this character had him a little less suave, and more like a human rat, let's say. Grubby, bit of a paunch. But then it was thought, well yeah, you know, what if he looked more like Han Solo, but with like big old shoulder pads. And like Han Solo, he comes equipped with his very own Millennium Falcon. Sorry, I mean Carillion Freighter in the form of the Outrider. This design by Doug Chang certainly invokes the spirit of the Falcon, but it can also do this. And that's great. And I probably sound like I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not. I really think this is a great design. Dash also comes equipped with his own tragic backstory. He was from a prominent family that was ruined by the Emperor due to his brother's involvement in a piloting accident. Meaning that, you know, he's got no love for those in charge, but his allegiance only extends as far as his money lasts. Until, of course, he steps up to become the hero he was born to be, like a certain other Han Solo type by the name of Han Solo. Most, though, remember Shadows of the Empire for its most iconic level, a recreation of the Battle of Hoth. A spectacular, fully rendered 3D environment, the likes of which had never been seen before. The music, the sound effects, chatter between pilots, the way you can loop around an AT-AT and bring it down. This whole section is really standout and was a major selling point for the game. You can even fly through their legs! The other levels don't quite reach the pinnacle of the first. So after the Empire destroys the Rebellion bike rack, you head inside the Rebel base to take on snowtroopers and a barrage of Wampas that take 1,000,000 years to bring down. Guiding you through this early stage is your co-pilot Lebo, whom I can only assume is some kind of reprogrammed former game show host.
The power has been restored. Find your way to the ship.
And look, the controls are not great, and Dash himself feels floaty and imprecise, but it's not completely broken. The boss battles are certainly memorable, including an AT-ST, a giant Diogna, you know, the creature with the eye in the trash compactor, but a big one. A frightening encounter with IG-88 on a junk planet that feels very reminiscent of something out of the first Terminator, and then we get Boba Fett himself. This encounter ends with him comically tumbling inside Slave 1 before you finish him off. And by that I mean he escapes to tumble into a different thing in a follow-up story. There's also a showdown with one of Shizor's gladiator droids, which has you whittle him down till he's just a head. Interspersed throughout the game are levels with a handful of differently styled stages, such as a wonky speeder bike chase through Mos Eisley and then Beggar's Canyon. Up the Sarlacc lookout! Plus some on-rail turret sections that, despite being limited in movement, feel chaotic and large in scale. The final battle in particular feels this way, with what feels like dozens of ships attacking all at once as you mount your escape from Shizor's forces and the Empire. The way the programmers accomplished this was by having two fighters sharing the same programmed decisions, so they really only need the processing power of one. Or you have, say, a group of 5 ships and have 4 following one who makes all the decisions. It's a really clever workaround for the limitations of the day. Overall, I enjoyed my recent playthrough of this game, though it is still very much of its time. I did encounter a few glitches, such as stairs or floating magically, and having the floor sometimes being devoid of all friction, and I just slide off the edge of a cliff. But also you get a jetpack at one point, and that's pretty great. The ending, however, narratively, really sets the game apart from both the comic and novel. In every other medium, Dash Rendar is seen to be killed in the final space battle. The idea originally was to have Luke take over for him in the final mission, but that didn't feel right, seeing as players spent the entire time becoming acquainted with Dash's big old shoulder pads. So you play as Dash in the final level and are killed, but a secret ending was added, showing that both he and Leebo escaped and chose to lay low for the rest of the Star Wars. Because, you know, Star Wars already had a Han Solo type in Han Solo. I mean, not anymore. Maybe this is a good time for Dash Rendar to return. Cast Jeff Bridges. I mean, who else you gonna get? Shadows of the Empire, the game, is at times a good representation of the Star Wars universe. John Knowles, in hindsight, feels that the game tried to do a little too much and that they should have attempted 2 things instead of, say, 5, especially considering that the N64 was still in its infancy. But still, the good work on this did make its way into follow-up Star Wars Nintendo 64 games. Funny story though, Shigeru Miyamoto, who's been pivotal in some of the best games across Nintendo's various platforms, was working on Mario 64 around the same time. And he wasn't super impressed with the work being done on Shadows, so he made some suggestions, such as to have Dash's feet always visible, so you can get a better sense of his movement in the environment, and to place the camera behind him in such a way that it's as if a balloon is attached to him via a string, and it would just kind of follow him around. He was also quoted as saying, though this was through a translator, "Do you not take pride in your animation?" That apparently bummed everyone out on the day. But hey, I'll say this. If you only play one Star Wars PC game released in 1997, make sure that it's Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight. But if you play 2, play Star Wars X-Wing vs TIE Fighter. But if you play 3, play Star Wars Masters of Teräs Kasai, because it's hilariously bad, but honestly, it's not that bad. It's a bit of a laugh. But if you play 4... okay, make your 4th one Shadows of the Empire. Okay, so leading up to the launch of all things Shadows of the Empire, Lucasfilm released a trailer of sorts, incorporating original trilogy footage to emphasize the cinematic nature of this project.
After the Empire Strikes Back and before Return of the Jedi, there was a time when heroes and villains alike lived in the shadows of the Empire.
Apparently though, this was pulled because it was thought it might confuse people into thinking that this was going to be a movie and not all of the things except for a movie. And by all of the things I mean, there was a hell of a lot of tie-in merch to accompany Shadows. An official soundtrack was made available by Emmy award-winning composer Joel McNeely, whose work includes the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles and The Avengers, not that one. Originally, an album was supposed to accompany the Thrawn trilogy, but when word of Shadows of the Empire's release began, the focus shifted to that. Apparently, McNeely found a freedom in composing this album like no other, because it didn't have to be synced up with any movie. Recorded in early 1996 by the 90-piece Royal Scottish National Orchestra, plus a 15-person choir, McNeely aimed not to try and replicate John Williams' famous score, but rather use what has come before as its pillars. Pieces were developed for Coruscant, the Beggar's Canyon chase, as well as Shizor's theme. McNeely asked legendary sound designer Ben Burt to write a Germanic-sounding poem, which ended up being Daha Verda, pronounced differently from that probably. That would be sung on the track. Released on CD and cassette tape, the score was also weaved into the abridged audiobook and video game. Within the CD is also a look behind the scenes, including biographies on prominent Shadows of the Empire creators, plus a look in on the recording session. For the life of me, I could not get this to work, but it's probably there, so I'm told. Topps released a set of 100 trading cards with colour illustrations from brothers Greg and Tim Hildebrandt. These span the length of the tale with narrative explanation on the back and are broken up into story, characters, starships and vehicles, interpretations of the comic, and also the video game. The Hildebrandts went about underlining sections of the book that they thought would make good images, and using live models to capture positions and lighting. They were also careful not to use too much detail in their artwork, as when these things are shrunken down, they can appear muddy and lose their impact. There was also this terrifying Shizor latex mask. I just want to add on a personal note, the human responsible for this should go to jail forever. Also, we got a West End role-playing game. It expands on the environments, introduces new bounty hunters, aliens, and technology. However, it was strictly stated that the Clone Wars was off limits, as George Lucas himself planned to cover them in his movies. And by that I mean the very start of the Clone Wars, and then the very end, and then do all the stuff in the middle in an animated series that ran for a bit, but then it was cancelled, and then it was picked up again in 2019. Just as always intended, no doubt. Star Wars, though, isn't Star Wars without its toys. In the late 70s onwards, recreating the movies from home was sometimes the only option for revisiting them.
Tauntaun comes with an open belly rescue feature.
You'll be okay, Luke.
As such, the toy line has accounted for a massive amount of Lucasfilm's profits over the years, with Kenner selling 40 million units alone in 1978. Kenner again would create the line for Shadows, which would launch alongside the popular Power of the Force series, consisting of 5 core action figures. Chewbacca in Bounty Hunter disguise, Dash Rendar, Leia in Bosch disguise, Luke Skywalker in Imperial Guard disguise, and Prince Shizor. Multi-packs were also released that paired up Boba Fett and IG-88, plus Prince Shizor and Darth Vader, plus we got 3 of the vehicles seen in the narrative. Boba Fett's Slave 1, a swoop bike, and Dash Rendar's Outrider. There's also this sculpture, which I refused to buy, as when that mask arrived at my house I thought, you know what, I think I've gone too far on this. Also, we got 10-inch action figures for both Shizor and Dash Rendar. Glad I bought that for that couple of seconds of screen time. Micro Machines also got in on the action with a set of figures and vehicles. And there was also, of course, the accompanying toy commercials.
Cruel crime lord Shizor directs the carbonite capture of Han Solo and his imprisonment aboard bounty hunter Boba Fett's battle-ready Slave 1. Now, Luke Skywalker goes undercover with Soldier of Fortune Dash Rendar as he rips through space in his battle-transforming Outrider.
And if that voice sounds familiar, well, that's because it's none other than Luke Skywalker himself, Mark Hamill. Shadows of the Empire is no longer canon. With Disney's purchase of Lucasfilm came a new continuity that removed almost all the books, telemovies, TV shows, comics, video games, and immensely popular holiday specials. But that's not to say that echoes of this hugely successful launch weren't felt, and still are to this day. As mentioned earlier, a big part of this project was conceived as a dry run for the juggernaut which would be the marketing for the Phantom Menace. With its dozens of new action figures, multiple tie-in books, some being the same book but with different covers, a spoiler-heavy soundtrack, and a Jar Jar Binks lollipop that forces you to put his tongue in your mouth. A similar, albeit smaller campaign also launched the game The Force Unleashed in 2008. And the Star Wars Disney Park Galaxy's Edge also began generating interest with its own John Williams music, Marvel tie-in comic books, and novels, because again, it's something with all the hype of a Star Wars movie release without a movie. And although these stories are no longer canon, its influence has snuck its way into multiple Star Wars projects that are now officially in-universe. The Fallen Species has shown up in a number of stories, including as part of the Black Sun crime syndicate in the Clone Wars. Prince Shizor himself even appears in the Phantom Menace as a crowd member present during Anakin's pod race. The miniature used was actually from the Micro Machines toy line, but that does mean that he does exist in some form in the universe. Swoop bikes have also been made canon. They were thrust into live action with the release of Solo, A Star Wars Story. In that movie we also get mention of and see Teräs Kasai, the ancient martial art invented by Steve Perry for the novel, and the basis of a wonderful video game. Of course, there's also official things in Star Wars canon that now directly contradict the events of Shadows of the Empire, including that Princess Leia now receives that bounty hunter costume by shriveled walnut person Maz Kanata in the animated series Star Wars Forces of Destiny. Dash Rendar was also made canon in a Solo spin-off story Tales from Vandor. Other than a brief mention of his friendly rivalry with Han Solo, nothing else about that character has been made canon. The Outrider, or that exact ship model, has made a number of in-canon appearances, including but not exclusively Star Wars issue 61, the episode Iron Squadron of Star Wars Rebels, as well as the fact that it's seen leaving Mos Eisley in the 1997 re-release of Star Wars A New Hope. The chances that the full story of Shadows of the Empire will make its way into official canon, I feel, are fairly unlikely. Even though the time between Empire and Jedi is still largely unexplored, I don't feel it makes sense financially for Lucasfilm just to make an existing story canon again, as opposed to creating a new and ongoing comic series, similar to the stories we've got set between A New Hope and Empire, plus new novels, TV shows, and of course movies. Which is kind of a shame because of all the expanded universe material that's now Legends, Shadows of the Empire, I feel, is one of the best. No doubt due to the care and attention put in from Lucasfilm that brought all sorts of creatives together to make this happen. What though does the creator, George Lucas himself, have to say about Shadows of the Empire? Well, not much. His involvement appears to have extended as far as making sure the emphasis was on exploring the underworld. But I would hazard a guess that if he's read the book, he'd love it, which he almost certainly hasn't.
Vader waved his hand over the motion-sensitive controls in his chamber. The spherical chamber opened and the lid lifted with a hydraulic hiss and escape of pressurized air. He sat exposed to the surrounding room, unprotected by the super-medicated and oxygenated field inside the chamber. He concentrated on the injustice of his condition, on his hatred of Obi-Wan, who had made him so. With the anger and hatred, the dark side of the Force permeated Vader. For a moment, his ruined tissues altered, his scarred lungs and dead alveoli and constricted passages smoothed out and became whole. For a moment, he could breathe as normal beings breathed. His sense of relief, his triumph, his joy at being able to do so drove the dark side from him as surely as a light chases away shadow. The dark side eagerly consumed Vader, but it was poisoned by happiness. It left him, and when it did, he could breathe no longer. Vader waved his hand, and the half-dome lowered and sealed him into the chamber once again. He had achieved it briefly, as he had done several times before. The trick was to maintain it. He must not allow himself to feel relief, but must somehow cling to his rage even as he healed. It was difficult. He had not purged all of Anakin Skywalker, that blemished and frail man from whom he had been born. Until he did, he could never give himself over totally to the dark side. It was his greatest weakness, his most terrible flaw. A single spot of light amid the dark that he had been unable to eradicate over all the years, no matter how hard he tried. Vader sighed. He would have to try harder. He could not afford any weaknesses, given his enemies, and more especially, given his friends.
This project was a huge undertaking, easily the most complicated and expensive thing I've ever done. And I didn't really want to run any sponsorship on it, because it kind of broke the flow. But I do love making these long-form videos, and would like to do more of that, hopefully with a bit of a quicker turnaround. Because this took forever! So what I'm saying is, if you would like to support any future projects along these lines, well, you can do that at patreon.com/MrSundayMovies. Also, and I'm sure this is fairly evident, I was not alone in putting this together. The 3D recreations were expertly rendered by Matt Grenier over many painstaking months. He specializes in 3D work with a focus on rendering and storytelling, and that's his website right there. He's a delight to work with, and I highly recommend him. Along with Sal Crivelli. He provided the narration for said animations, and you can find him over at the excellent YouTube channel Comic Pop. One of my favorite shows from over there is Back Issues. If you like this video, you'll almost certainly like that. The comic book animations were brought to life by Eric Chen. Well, the good ones, at least. I did the crap ones. Thank you so much, Eric, for squeezing me in at the last minute. I know how busy your schedule is. And also the action figures and vehicles, the bulk of them were provided by my brother, the one Mason doesn't like, and I appreciate him having those, so I didn't have to buy them. Here is a list of additional things used, including references, videos, images, and the like, but probably the largest chunk of research from this came from the book Secrets of the Shadows of the Empire by Mark Kotovaz, and of course links to where you can find all of those things and people are below in the description. Please check them all out if you can. I really encourage you to keep an eye on all of their work, or maybe tee up a collaboration. Also be sure to subscribe to this channel if you like, because there's videos here every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and also I do a podcast every Monday morning for The Weekly Planet, where we talk movies and comics and TV shows. But honestly, I just appreciate you checking this video out, even if it is a one-off. So thanks for the support. Take care.